Hello and welcome to Growing School Gardens. My name's Allison and I'm a program coordinator with Waterloo Region School Food Gardens, and I'm excited to be talking to you today about growing school gardens. So in this webinar, we're going to talk about Waterloo Region School Food Gardens, what we do, a bit of the background on the school food garden movement, why we garden in schools, some of the challenges around school gardening and how we can grow around them, and some pointers around starting a garden at your school. So Waterloo Region School Food Gardens is a project of Seeds of Diversity Canada. We're funded by a grow grant for the past 3 years from the Ontario Trillium Foundation. We were founded prior to this grant out of a partnership between public health, local teachers, and parents to explore school gardening, and then some smaller grants that grew into this, and we're excited to continue on beyond 2022. We are supported beyond our Trillium grant by community donations and fundraising, and we really appreciate that support in keeping us going. So Waterloo Region School Food Gardens is a pretty tiny organization. In the winter, we are 3 part-time staff, and between the 3 of us, we make up less than 1 full-time position. But we can get a lot done with 3 people. And in the summer, we add in up to 4 full-time summer students to fill in all of the things in one of our busiest seasons. We work with schools across Waterloo Region. We do funding for garden builds led by teachers, parents, and students. And our builds are only possible, again, with a staff this size, with help from our community volunteers. The other amazing part of our program is our youth participants. So throughout the year, we've had an amazing team of young volunteers. We've spent the past couple of years really experimenting with engaging youth online and in hybrid models. And we've developed some in-person and hybrid summer programs, and we run all of our social media and a lot of our summer programming with some incredible support from some young volunteers. So what Waterloo Region School Foods Gardens does. It's a fair number of things, and it's always changing and growing, but our current focus is hybrid programs that support youth in engaging with food systems in whatever way is accessible to them, whether that be through a school garden, whether that be online, whether that be through a mix of the two. We provide some funding and support for building and improving school gardens in Waterloo Region. We help out schools with summer maintenance and support for their gardens. We also run a youth-led farmers market using produce from our school gardens and donated by wonderful partners at local farms. And we work on developing educational resources for students and staff. So, school food gardens. School food gardens are not a new thing, but over the past 10 years or so, we've really seen a growth in them across Canada, North America, and around the world. But schools in Canada have been gardening for many reasons for more than a century, from victory gardens during the World Wars, addressing food rationing and meeting supply needs. It's been a place for place-based and alternative learning. It's been a place for outdoor education in schools. And it's also a place where a lot of schools and communities are focusing on learning about food security. And our programming is based out of Waterloo Region, and schools in Waterloo Region have a pretty unique experience. They have been gardening for well over a decade. We have a really neat mix of urban and rural communities here, and our schools are able to meet the learning needs of students interested in working in a lot of different fields. We have more than 40 school gardens and growing in the region, and there are a lot of unique programs in our schools designed and built by schools to meet their own unique needs. And our school partnerships are with us. Between our schools, they work together, particularly between elementary and secondary schools. Our schools partner with local gardeners and supply organizations, and they also partner with other growing organizations. So why do we garden in schools? There are so many benefits. I could do a whole other presentation on this. But there's a few main things that we focus on when we're talking about the benefits of having gardens in schools. And those are the educational benefits, the health benefits, student development, and community development. So gardens in schools have a lot of different educational benefits. And one of the most fundamental ones is life skills. Learning how to grow and prepare your own food is a life skill, and that's an important thing that we're seeing more and more that kids need to be learning at all levels. When we're looking at how gardens in schools can support learning in the more traditional sense, in the academic sense, we see that having gardens in schools and garden-based learning can actually support improvements in standardized test scores in the core sciences and environmental studies. It also supports learning across a lot of different subjects. It can be used as a space to enhance learning in biology, in the arts, in the social sciences. And having garden spaces on school sites and as part of school programming can actually help students in their focus, being able to participate outdoors, having access to green space. It can lead to reductions in student stress, which of course helps them learn. And it also creates a lot of different spaces in schools that support a lot of different kinds of learners. One of my favorite things a teacher has ever said to me was explaining how the garden on their school, and particularly having animals at their school, created a space for some students who hadn't always felt like they belonged in school. And her explanation for this was some kids don't always get a chance to shine, but with the chickens they can shine. So it's about finding places where every kid has a chance to show off their own kind of learning, find a place where they can thrive, and supporting a lot of different kinds of learning in one space. So the health benefits of gardening are also really important. Kids who garden have increased knowledge of fruits and vegetables. They're often willing to try new foods that they wouldn't have otherwise tried. They have an increased understanding of food systems and sustainable choices. Being out in the garden can provide physical activity. And the time spent outdoors and in green spaces has a lot of benefits for mental health for students, staff, and everyone involved. And even if it's not a part of class, a part of their regular schedule, having a green space at school, having that on campus and accessible to students, is a really, really important thing for them to have to be able to reduce stress. So at our secondary schools, we hear a lot about students going into the garden on their lunch break to relax, going to sit in the greenhouses during exams. They really do find it a place that can reduce their stress and provide a positive mental and health space on campus. And the other thing is, beyond the individual, gardens are a really great place for partnership. So garden programs provide opportunities for students, parents, teachers, and neighbors to get involved. They can help develop a sense of community around the garden. They also create a lot of opportunities for students to lead and take ownership at school, and for students to have a space where they get to be in charge of certain plants or their own garden bed, and provide certain resources to the school, whether that be giving their time to take care of the garden, maybe taking responsibility for supplying supplies for other programs. That can really build student engagement, and it can also build a broader sense of citizenship and responsibility. So this is in particular when gardens tie into other programs. So for example, some of the school gardens actually support providing some of the supplies for cooking classes, or we have some of our schools that provide resources for other schools, like helping build their composters. Some of our schools run miniature markets where they sell produce from their gardens, and having these things built in together really gives a student a sense of impact beyond just themselves. And that can be really powerful for a lot of students. So the past couple of years have been pretty challenging for schools and so many people. I don't need to tell you that. And we've encountered some interesting challenges in school gardening. There are always barriers to building new programs and running anything extra in a school. But in particular, the past couple of years have been a little bit hard, but we found some pretty exciting ways to move through this. So 2020 was a big surprise for everyone, and it's been a pretty challenging time for schools to do things like planning and building physical resources like gardens. We had some schools that were really excited to receive funding and start building their own garden, but a lot of those plans had to get put on pause. So some schools weren't able to be in person. There were school shutdowns. Sometimes there were limitations around how people could use space on campus or who could be there. But we've also learned a lot about the benefits of outdoor spaces at school and how much students can really benefit from in-person hands-on learning opportunities that they weren't getting for a while. So one of the big challenges in starting up a school garden is resources. There are startup costs and commitments to plan around when you're starting a garden. And these aren't just financial. There's people power, which is a huge factor. It takes people to run a garden. It takes people to do the planning. It takes commitment to maintaining the space on site. It takes commitment to starting seedlings, maintaining the garden. There are financial costs to starting up as well, obviously. There are seedlings to buy, soil. There's a lot of this that can be done really cheaply, and we'll talk later on about how we can work around these costs or build up resources for your school. But one of the big things to think about with these resources is sustainability. It can be another challenge. It's really easy to find short-term funding, to find a one-off startup grant for a garden. It can be a little bit harder to find that money when you're looking to renew your soil or do some repair work on your garden. That's something to keep in mind because gardens do have a certain amount of maintenance to them. But again, there are places to find these resources. A big challenge we face in Canada is that our growing season doesn't necessarily align with the school year a lot of the time. So the prime time for caring for gardens and seeing a lot of the results unfortunately happens over the summer when students aren't in school. This can be challenging, but there's also some really creative ways we've seen our schools plan around this and make space for exciting, spring planting opportunities, fall harvesting opportunities, and making that summer maintenance a little bit easier on them. And as I just mentioned, summer maintenance is a huge problem for a lot of schools. There's some really, really neat solutions that have been found around this, but particularly for schools that might be magnet schools, that might have a lot of commuter students, it can be a challenge when students and staff don't live nearby, and it can also be a challenge for students and staff who do live nearby to have to give up part of their summer to do that. But there's a lot of ways you can balance that work. Another important thing to keep in mind is that facility staff often rotate between schools and they don't always get involved in the planning work here. So it's important to know who's on site in the summer and to work with facility staff so that you can work together on maintaining the garden. And another big thing to think about in planning, and one of the challenges we've seen, is communication with neighbors. So sometimes neighbors want to help out in the garden, but they don't know if they're allowed. Sometimes neighbors come in and harvest and they're not sure if that's allowed. Sometimes neighbors are totally welcome, but they don't know that. Sometimes people want to help by doing things like mowing the lawn or weeding, but they don't know what the school actually needs. So letting your neighbors know about the garden, letting them know kind of what your boundaries are there and how you can share that space together is another really important part of planning for that maintenance when you're not on site. And so some of these things are challenges in terms of starting things up and things to think about in your planning. And some of these can be challenges for long-term sustainability. So unfortunately, without some of these surprises we've seen over the past few years, it can be difficult to maintain gardens long-term. And these can be challenges in terms of funding, it can be challenges in terms of staffing, it can be challenges in terms of volunteers, especially in schools where your cohorts graduate every few years, parents and students might move around. Staff might rotate to different schools. Again, that summer maintenance can be a challenge, and sometimes letting it go for one summer can lead to it not starting up again. And there's also some long-term upkeep costs, but all of these are things that we can work around. So as we have been growing and as our schools have been growing for a very long time, our local gardens and gardens in a lot of places have found some great solutions to growing through challenges. So as we've seen over the past few years, there's been a big embracing of outdoor learning in schools when it's been challenging to be together inside. I know the kids in this picture are a little bit close together, but realizing that schools that have outdoor space for learning have spaces where it's safe to do hands-on learning with students with open air. That might be a little bit better for COVID safety, and that these are valuable resources for really in-person hands-on activities. Another thing that schools have done when they're not sure about outdoor space or where they might have limitations there is adding indoor growing. So outside isn't the only place you can grow. There are different types of indoor growing setups that you can bring into the classroom to really help you work around those time cycle limitations of the school year and bring growing into the classroom year-round. One of the most important things that have helped our schools succeed, that have helped us succeed as an organization, is partnerships and volunteers. So I love this picture because it involves our executive director of Seeds at Diversity working with some of our high school volunteers at an elementary school site that generously let us use their garden for our programming over the summer, next to a composter that was built by one of our high school partners. So when we all work together, we can really help and fill in the gaps to make sure gardens have what they need to thrive in schools. And a lot of schools have found that if they put out the word for they're looking for a composter, there might be another school that's looking for a build project. If they're looking for some help with maintenance, there might be some local students who are looking for volunteer hours, and you can work together to figure out how to overcome those challenges. So if you're thinking about starting your own garden, we have some advice to help you out in your planning. And despite all these challenges, it is an incredibly rewarding process, and these things are easily overcome, and it's completely worth the time and energy you put in. So, some steps to keep in mind in starting a school garden. One of the biggest things you need to do is build your garden team. You can run a garden with one person, but it's really, really hard, and some of those sustainability challenges become even bigger when there's only one person that everything counts on. Once you have your garden team, you can make your plan together. You find your resources and your partners. You plan your build and actually get your garden growing. And then once you've done that, keeping in touch and working together for a sustainable garden. So we're going to talk about each of these steps in a bit more depth. The very first thing you need to do is really finding the garden champions in your community, whether that be at your school, whether that be in your neighborhood, whether that be among your friend network, or wherever in your community you can find it. The more people who are representing different roles, who have input and investment, the better. So that means hearing from teachers, from parents, from administration. Students can have a really strong voice in this too. They're the ones who are there every day. Support staff, and also your neighbors. And bringing these people together, whether that be around, just consulting and planning for the initial project or being involved on a more regular basis in your garden, is a really, really helpful thing to help it succeed. Once you have your garden team, you're going to want to figure out kind of the parameters of what you're doing and do some research and share the results to kind of build your plan. So some things to think about are, what kind of garden do you want? Is it a food garden? Is it a pollinator garden? Is it just a green space on your school campus? Where will it be? What will you grow? Who is going to use it and how and at what times? That can be a bit of a scheduling challenge when there's lots of students and lots of classes who want to use the garden. And then who's going to maintain that garden and how? Now, based on what you learned there, you identify what you need to build that garden that you've envisioned. And that's probably going to involve a bit of funding to start up. That's almost certainly going to involve some equipment. And what you need most of all is people. So from there, you can identify the roles and responsibilities and really try and make sure that your tasks are spread out in fair and manageable ways to make this sustainable for everyone. And once you've identified kind of what you'd like to build with your garden and what you're going to need to do it, you can start to feel out your partners and resources. So a big thing is figuring out who needs to approve before you build. That might be just your school administration. It might be your principal. It might have to go to the school board. You might need to check your local zoning requirements. You just want to check that out before you get started. A lot of the time it's quite simple, but it's always worth asking before you start. Another thing to consider is where you can get funding and resources. So some school boards have their own funding, and it never hurts to ask. So if your school board has a sustainability officer, if your school board has someone who does kind of environmental studies work, if your school board has someone who is in charge of facilities in some way, there's probably someone there you can talk to about whether or not there's funding. And even if your school board itself doesn't have funding, they might be able to support you in other ways, whether that be connecting you with a volunteer crew, getting some gardening advice from another expert in the board, doing some workshops with your teachers, finding some curriculum support. There's probably another teacher in your board who's looking to do the same thing and might have resources to share. So it's always a good idea to just ask whoever is at your school board that you're in touch with about what's available to you when you're starting. More and more schools are starting to do this, and more school boards are starting to prepare for school gardens. Beyond your own school, you can look at not-for-profit organizations with community grant programs. So there's a lot of nonprofits like Waterloo Region School Food Gardens. Unfortunately, our funding applies only to Waterloo Region at the moment. We would love to expand someday, but that's our eligibility right now. There's also for-profit organizations like banks, supply companies like Home Depot, local businesses that might have things like one-off grant programs. They might have discounts for you on supplies. So if you do your research, you can find a lot of little pools of funding you can bring together. And it can be a bit of a challenge writing up your first application, but once you have that initial planning information, and once you have your grant team together, if you can put together one application, quite often that can roll really easily into writing others. And the next step, once you've found your funding and you know what you're going to do, is really getting into thoroughly planning your garden. So you've taken a look at where on your site you can build your garden. What is your garden space like? What kind of sunlight does it get? What is your soil quality? Are you going to need to add more soil? Do you need to raise your beds? What kind of shape do you want it to take? Another really important question is water access. So on a lot of schools, you're able to access water on the outside through water mains that are placed around the school. And in your planning, you really want to locate those, because the worst thing to do is get to a school garden and realize that you have to walk all the way around the school with a bucket full of water. It's too long to run a hose, or even worse, that you don't have outdoor water access and you have to figure out, a deeper plan to that. This is also easy to overcome. We can do things like rain barrels. We can do, a lot of different water solutions. But you want to know as you're getting into it what your water access looks like, because that's going to affect your planting and maintenance plan. Another thing to think about is accessibility. So how many people are going to be working in the garden? What are their access needs? Do you want to raise the bed enough for someone who might use a wheelchair, for someone who might have trouble bending over? Do you want to keep it low to the ground for really young kids? There's lots of different needs that you can work around in the garden, and you just want to think about who's going to be using it. Another thing to think about is how much space is between your garden plots. If you're going to have, large groups of students working in these times, you might need to consider what the distancing requirements might be. You might also want to think about how easy it is to move past each other with tools as you're going back and forth between the beds. So all of these are things you can take into account in your planning. And the next thing to think about, particularly when you're choosing your plants, is maintenance. So who can take care of the garden and at what times? Because your crew might look really different during the school year than it does over the summer or on holidays. So at what times? Is there one class at the school that meets 3 times a week that can check in on the garden? And can they do maintenance tasks at each of those times? Can we have a regular group of volunteers who goes after school a few days a week? And then what is the knowledge base and what are the skills of your volunteers? So we've had some challenges come up around, lovely volunteers from the community offering to take care of the garden, but not knowing how to identify the plants that the schools have planted and not really being sure, what's a weed that I should pull, what's a plant that they're trying to grow that I should leave. So figuring out how much the people who are maintaining and working in your garden know and what information you can provide them with to help them do that maintenance. And the last thing to keep in mind is upkeep and repair. So ideally you build yourself, the garden design that works for you. What kind of things will you want to think about in, maybe 5 years in terms of, will you need to be replacing potentially some of the soil? Will you want to be adding fertilizer? What will you do if some of the boards start to possibly pull out from your raised beds? How are you going to handle any of these challenges that come up? Again, these challenges do come up and they're really easy to overcome if you have a plan and if you know who to talk to when these things come up. So from there, when you know what you want to build and you have your team and you have your funding, you're going to want to gather all of your resources, figure out the supplies that you need. So your lumber, your screws, your dirt, your seeds, and particularly in these times, to make sure they're in time and ready for your build day, try and order quite early, especially in the spring. We often order our lumber to be delivered to our schools that are doing builds a day or 2 early, just to make sure it's all there and ready when our volunteers get there. You're going to want to identify your build team. And these don't need to be people that are going to be involved forever. This might be staff, parents, students, community volunteers. Maybe you have a local carpenter. Maybe you have a local master gardener who can come in and help you for that day. And you'll also want to find most likely, again, depending on what kind of garden you're building, some tools. If it's, nothing that involves construction, then maybe you just need some shovels, some buckets, rakes, things like that to handle the soil. If it's something like a raised bed, you're probably going to need things like drills or impact drivers, some hammers, some mallets. If you're getting a big amount of soil delivered, you might want some tarps to lay it on. And a lot of these things are things you don't need to buy. They're things that are often around in your community. Your neighbors might have them, and they can be borrowed for the day. And then, you can ask for them again if you need them to do some repairs or another big maintenance day, but you don't need to purchase them for a single day. A big thing to keep in mind in all of your plans for your garden is, again, we've said there's those big kind of challenges to sustainability in your garden, and you want to plan a garden that's going to last for as long as your school can use it. So garden teams based out of schools are almost necessarily going to change over time. Students graduate, teachers, move on to different positions, parents move neighborhoods. And so you want to think about, how can you make sure that you have someone to pass the garden on to in the next generation? And a lot of the time that means kind of continuously bringing in new people. Another thing to consider is, you want leaders. You want people who can, give some direction and kind of guide people in the garden. But sometimes what that turns into is having, everything relying on one person. And that's a lot to ask of one person, and it also means other people might not know how to get involved. So the best thing you can do is have multiple leaders, having different people who might support the garden in different ways, and who are maybe ready to pass on some leadership to new people in the community. So when you're planning for your garden, you want to plan to keep in touch. You might want to have some regular garden meetings or some sort of regular communication. And you want to plan some structure around, who's in charge of this? Who might be the point person for questions about the garden? And quite often that's someone on the school staff. But it's good to know the name of that. It's good to have that, documented somewhere. And something really helpful as you're handing off gardens to, the next generation of leaders is to document what you did and why. If you got funding at one point for some sort of maintenance, for soil, for seedlings, or you partnered with a local organization who donated things, keep a track of that. Keep in touch with that organization, pass on that contact to someone new, because that question will almost certainly come up again in a few years, and it's great for people to be able to learn from what you learned. So keeping track of your resources, the different things that you've done over time, the problems you faced and how you solved them are really, really useful for helping keeping your garden going and helping, the future of your garden. So when you're planning your build day, this can be a really, really great community event. Sometimes it makes sense to get everyone together all on one day to build the garden. You can make it kind of a party. We'll have schools just set a date and say, this weekend we're going to have everybody come out at 10 a.m. on a Saturday, bring your power tools, we'll get the soil delivered, and we'll make it a giant community party. And at the end of the day, we'll have everything built and the gardens are planted and ready to go. Sometimes not everyone's free on one day. Sometimes you're not sure about the timing of different items, and it might be better to separate out the building of the beds, the soil delivery, and the planting into separate days. And each of those can be super fun events, but it might make sense to have them, spaced out over different weekends or have a different class be in charge of each different one. So it's not a big deal if it can't be all one day, but if you have the time and if it makes sense for your community, each of these different phases or one single day can be a really, really great excuse to bring everyone together and kind of celebrate what you're building together. Doing this stuff as a team can also really build investment from your school, from your community, in the garden that you've built. And once your garden's growing, it's important to figure out some mechanism for keeping your garden team in touch on a regular basis. Again, whether that be a newsletter, whether that be an annual meeting, having it be on the agenda at some parent-teacher meetings. It's really easy to lose track of roles over time. It's easy to lose touch with people and to not be sure about where to go with certain things in terms of maintenance or other things a garden might need if your team doesn't stay in touch. So the best way to keep your garden growing in the long term is to make a deliberate plan and make an effort to keep everyone engaged and communicating in some way. So that might be creating regular events, it might be having meetings, whatever you need to do to make sure that everyone's on the same page and aware of what the garden needs. And last but not least, enjoy the garden that you've built. You've put in a lot of time and energy, and it will be worth it. Sometimes your first year might be a little slow, but enjoy that learning process. You'll find out as you go, the different ways that your energy might come back to you. You might have, a slow first year and a fantastic harvest the second year, but take the time to celebrate as a community and as an individual what you've built. We know the kids will enjoy it, and we find that our communities can really have a great time. If you have any questions, if you want to learn more about starting a school garden, please feel free to be in touch with us. Our email is wrsfg@gmail.com. And you can also check out our website at seeds.ca/schoolfoodgardens. And again, please feel free to be in touch. We're happy to give you advice, or if we can't help you out, we're happy to see if we can point you in the right direction. We hope you have a fantastic spring and a happy garden season.